And then I realized those weren't bubbles, those were thousands of termites.
When we moved in, it was just like literally a kitchen sink.
The big takeaway here is nudity is forbidden in your garden.
Well, even one at a time.
Henry loves picking these wild raspberries, these wild black raspberries that we've semi-cultivated. He calls them rubbies, and he absolutely goes bonkers for them, which is tough because there's thorns, so you got to be careful with the toddler. Here, do you want the rubbies? Rubbies. Rubby. Just pound them, buddy. So things generally seem to be in order for the meat chickens. Their stall is ready to go. They've actually been spending the past few nights out here while I kind of double checked and did some finishing tweaks on their barn stall. That will be their home base, their coop. So they've spent the past few nights out here and they've done fine, but they're pretty much good to go. And now the countdown is on for when I'll be processing some of these guys to try them out and eat them. So my focus is shifting from getting the meat chicken stuff ready to the garden. And there's been a lot of lessons I've learned about the garden over the past few years, but there's one big lesson that I think is finally starting to sink into my thick skull, and that's never have open dirt, open soil. Always cover it up with something. You hear lots of folks Yeah, in the homesteading and permaculture community say stuff like Mother Nature is modest, keep her covered. And there's a lot of truth to that, and something I didn't really figure out until recently. That's the first thing I want to talk about. There's some alarming things that we need to discuss. I'll discuss later on. Let's talk about kind of a big failure I made in the garden, as well as what I'm doing to amend it going forward. Let's get into it. Before we get to the garden and the issues that we face with it, I do want to say that whatever issues we have on this homestead, growing berries is not one of them. We are being blessed with a crop of, oh boy, I don't know, buckets and buckets worth of these black raspberries. A lot of people, when they initially look at these, they think that they're blackberries, but they're not. These are actually black raspberries, and they grow like weeds on our property. Delicious, delicious weeds. And when I say they grow like weeds on our property, I mean that literally. They'll just pop up in random locations all around our property, in the front pasture, in these woods, in the back pastures. These things are everywhere, and I really think we need to start harnessing the power of berry production on this homestead, which is part of the reason we're starting the orchard, is we want to get serious about how well berries do on our land. We struggle with a lot of stuff on this land, but not berries. It's good to spend some time in your garden and in your area, even if that time is a few years, which it has been for us, because you get to learn the particularities and the quirks about your soil. One of the quirks that we have is Bermuda grass, which we've largely controlled in the beds, thankfully. Another quirk that we have is it's easy to grow berries. That's a good thing. But one thing that I've started to notice, again, it took me years to get this through my thick skull, is that if you leave the ground, the soil uncovered, it will be caught up with weeds. What kind of weeds? Well, for the longest time we dealt with Bermuda grass. Thankfully, in these beds, we're not really dealing with Bermuda grass anymore. We're dealing with things like clover and some sort of weird steppe, Japanese stair grass or whatever it's called, which thankfully is easy to pull out. But it just goes to show you that Mother Nature will cover herself if you leave her uncovered. And she'll typically cover herself with things that grow well. In our case, grasses of different kinds. So one of the things that I actually had the foresight to do this year, we had 2 empty beds, which we're going to save for later in the summer, and we'll use these for growing squash. We're skipping squash in the beginning of the summer just because of squash bugs, so we're going to plant a late squash harvest. So we're going to use these 2 beds for squash. So what I decided to do was, instead of just leaving these blank, I used a cover crop. In this case, buckwheat. And as you can see, the buckwheat has sprung up very prolifically in both of these beds. It's doing really good. It's getting close to flowering out and throwing down seeds. So I'll probably mow it with the weed whipper and flatten these and take off the heads so they don't lay down seed. But why is a cover crop, like with buckwheat or whatever you choose to use, why is it good? Well, everything below this is being fed nutritionally by the buckwheat, by this really healthy cover crop, and not by weeds. There will be no weeds. If I were to part the waters and look down here, we will not see any weeds on this soil because this soil is occupied. Because this soil is occupied, especially with something healthy like the cover crop. A quick update on some of these beds, like our beans are growing great. But as you can see, around the beans, there's these clovers growing up. Are clovers acceptable? Am I okay with clovers? Yes, I'll probably let these clovers grow. I think they're a nice complement to have with the beans. Meanwhile, you can see these old volunteer tomatoes growing up as well, which is interesting. We have a lot of volunteer tomatoes in these beds that have just kind of sprung up, which we'll let them volunteer for us. We'll take what they have to give us. I'll probably put some fencings down. Now, these tomato beds, the tomatoes are doing well, but so are the weeds, again, because I didn't really cover them up. So I've got to go through these beds, and this will be my task for the next few days, maybe the next week or two. Knock down the weeds where I find them, then cover them up. What I'll probably do is cover them up with straw as just a temporary mulch. Long-term vision is just to make sure I have cover crops everywhere where I don't have active vegetables or crops that I'm growing. We'll take a look at the pepper bed. Peppers are doing great. Thank you, peppers. They're looking good. We got some banana peppers here. We got some shishitos, which we've been picking every day, and they're very, very yummy. But as you can see, this whole bed is just a mess because it's covered with this grass. Thankfully, it's not Bermuda grass. It'll be pretty easy. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna clear out this section and then cover it up, mulch it for now with straw. And you guys get to watch me do that. Chickens will like that, that's for sure. You want that, Lenny? Lenny's not interested. Okay, so I've got most of the weeds out. Obviously, it's not perfect, but we're in a place where we can work with this now. So my next step is going to be to lay down my mulch, which you got to be careful. I'm using straw from a trusted local producer, a trusted local source of straw. You got to be careful when using straw or hay because a lot of places use various different pesticides and herbicides. And if you have a particular type of herbicide in the straw that you're using, well, say goodbye to all your plants. They'll just die. That's the herbicide's job. Luckily for me, we've got a trusted local source of straw that I know is herbicide and pesticide free. At least they say it is. I hope it is. And so this will be my next step, is just to lay this down as a nice solid mulch layer for the bed. As a final step, I'm going to be putting comfrey leaves down at the base of each plant. Again, this is something I'm going to do for all of my peppers, all of my tomatoes, basically everything that's not a green. I'm going to put some comfrey leaves at the bottom. A lot of people call comfrey green compost, and I found that to be true. We used comfrey to great effect last year, and it's kind of a miracle plant. We actually got all these comfreys from our friend Billy at Permapastures Farms. And for the first year, we put the root cuttings in the ground and we saw no growth. And I was like, oh man, maybe our soil just isn't good for comfrey. And then after that, they exploded. So comfrey is another thing that grows very well in our soil at the Homestead. We've been using it for various things. Chickens like to use it or like to eat it. And it's great for plants. This is another one of those plants that I think I'm going to try and take advantage of and propagate a bit more and grow a lot more of, and maybe start selling some of it, giving it away to friends. Comfrey is great. Comfrey is a wonderful thing. You can actually use it for a kind of a balm. People use for cuts and stuff, and we've done that before. We had a friend that made some comfrey balm for us, and we used it on like cuts, and it works great. It helps heal the cuts a lot faster than just healing them on their own. So I'm going to cut up several leaves of comfrey, enough to where I can give a pretty good covering around the base of each pepper plant. Basically, I'm just going to tuck these comfrey leaves underneath the base, or on the base of each one of these peppers. Doesn't need to be exact. We just want the pepper to know that this comfrey is here, helping it grow, giving it an extra boost of nutrients. Everything I've done so far is very, very easy. If you're dealing with weeds in your garden, obviously take the weeds out when you can, but then once you've done so, put in a good mulch and comfrey leaves. If you can grow comfrey, do that too, because that's really going to help. Heck, if you've got enough comfrey, just mulch the whole bed with comfrey. Why not? It'd be worth a shot. The big takeaway here is nudity is forbidden in your garden. No nudity allowed in your garden. Remember that. I did want to call out the sweet potato bed. Sweet potatoes ideally serve as a cover crop all on their own. I did have to come through and remove some of the weeds. You still see some of the weeds left. But as sweet potatoes mature, they start to spread over the entirety of the box. This is a big box, and I would say it's currently about 85-90% covered with spreading sweet potatoes. That's what we want. We want to encourage the sweet potatoes to spread and serve as their own cover crop. So I won't be adding straw or hay or any sort of mulch to this bed because the sweet potatoes are doing the job of covering it up for me. Thank you, sweet potatoes. So the big news this week was the discovery of thousands of termites that we saw originating from this stump right here. Now this stump was already like this when I cleared all this brush a month or two ago. And it was something that, obviously I need to get around to knocking this stump down. There were a few stumps that I was able to rip out with the tractor. This one is too close to our compost system. I wanted to remove this with a chainsaw, but I just haven't gotten around to it. I saw what looked like bubbles. Holly actually pointed it out to me. I saw what looked like bubbles floating away from this stump. It was 3 days ago. I was like, that's weird. Why are there bubbles coming from this stump? And then I realized those weren't bubbles. Those were thousands of termites. Termites, as you know, have wings and they fly. When you see a colony, a swarm of termites like this, your natural inclination is to freak out and rush and go and buy termite killer, which I did. I got termite killer, but when I came back from purchasing the termite killer, all the termites were gone. They weren't here anymore. They weren't on this log. They weren't on this stump. I kicked around to other parts of the area. There's an old dead tree trunk that's sitting here that I would imagine would be a pretty primo host for a swarm of termites, but there were no termites. I kicked, I looked around. So I still sprayed everything down with this termite killer, but it was so strange that this huge swarm of thousands of termites was no longer here, nowhere in sight. And I looked around, there are other dead trees in the woods, and I looked in there. Nothing. No termites anywhere to be found. They were here 1 minute and completely gone the next. So I've got the termite killer. I sprayed it in this area, and then I've searched around. Like, obviously, what's right there? A big old wooden barn. So I looked through the barn for any traces of termites, and I didn't see any. There's no termite activity on this barn, as far as I can tell. At least not anything apparent. I looked obviously by our house. I looked in the garden. I looked at this old garden shed. And then, my parents' house is right there, and they've got their own wooden shed and stuff, and there's Dad. And I asked, have you guys seen any termite stuff? And I don't think they have. What to do now other than keep an eye out for termites? So, Dad, I was talking to you about the termite infestation that we got and how it was strange that they just upped and disappeared. I've read in a few places that there are like traveling itinerant bands of termites that'll just go across the countryside.
Migratory
termites.
Okay.
I don't know if this was a case where it was like termites hit on this nasty old log and then moved on.
They get everything
or
they
if
wanted.
They're embedded and I just don't see them. Like they've got some sort of network with little larvae and...
But you've been back over there a couple times and haven't seen
I've been back over there every day, multiple times a day, and I haven't seen them.
Yeah.
So I looked in the barn and I looked over here and no sign of them. You had a pretty bad termite infestation a few years ago over there,
so,
right?
So just to the left-hand side of the garage, there used to be piles of wood. Well, there were piles of everything back there. When we moved in, there was just like literally a kitchen sink.
Yeah.
There was everything back there. So in removing all of that, I think the last bit of junk that I removed was just some old rotted wood. And it was termite heaven.
Thousands.
Hundreds
of thousands. Yeah.
It was like the logs were moving almost. It was just tremendous. So, yeah, I just used over-the-counter termite killer that you get at, I think I got it at Lowe's. just sprayed the snot out of them.
And then they went away.
Yes and no. Initially, it looked like it was going to be enough, but I don't know if it was, maybe larva that wasn't affected, but I had to hit it. Long story short, I had to hit it probably 3, maybe 4 times before it's just completely gone. So that was over the course of maybe a week and a half.
Did you see them show up anywhere else on the property?
No, actually from that time on, I don't know that I've seen any. So when you mentioned what you had going on over at your place, that's the first I'd heard of it for
I'll show you the
couple
video
years.
of it.
Yeah.
I basically, long story short, I don't know whether I should be concerned or just, what's the medical term? Watchful waiting, just vigilant, just keep an eye out for them. And I think that's what I'm going to do now is, like, for whatever reason, they're gone, they're not there. I've got the killer on, or the termite killer on hand. I'm just going to keep an eye out on these wooden structures, especially the barn and this shed. And then, to a certain extent, my house as well. But that's all I think I can do at the time is just keep an eye out,
just keep an eye
cross
out.
my fingers, and if I do see something, spring into action and kill them.
Thankfully, for now anyway, haven't seen any over here.
Looking for movement. Nothing.
Well, the snakes.
What is that?
Well, even one at a time.
Thanks for hanging out with me today, guys. Hanging out with us. Until we see you again next time, we're going to be busy picking rubbies and eating them. I think we're going to get buckets of them. Unless this little guy eats them all first. Until we see you again next time, remember, as always, slowly, slowly.